lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to begin to discuss a philosophical topic that is, well, really not just a central philosophical question or topic, but a question or topic that really is central to the way we live our lives as human beings. And that topic is death, and more specifically, the question we're going to be looking at is our death bad for us? How should we think about death? How should we live in the face of death? Now, a couple of points at the beginning. First, there's a sense in which we're not just beginning to talk about death with this lesson. Throughout the trial and death of Socrates, we saw that death was a topic that was at the forefront of the minds both of Socrates and Plato. Just a few examples. In the Apology, we saw that Socrates said he would not stop practicing philosophy even if he knew it would lead to his death. In the Phaedo, we saw Plato giving arguments for why he will survive his bodily death, for why his bodily death is to be embraced because it allows for the culmination of his philosophical project in which his immortal soul will finally be able to understand and be acquainted with the forms. So death has been, throughout this course already, an important topic. But I think it's worth really focusing in on it specifically. And one of the reasons for this is that I think it gives a unique shape to our human experience. Now, there are many ways in which the human being is different from other animals. We can point to many characteristics we have that other animals don't share, or at least don't share in the same degree. But I think one of the most central ways in which human beings do in fact differ from other animals is our conscious awareness of death. We don't just know about death in an abstract way or just about some fact in the world or something that happens to other people. We live knowing one day that we in fact will die. We live, in fact, knowing one day that we will meet our demise. And this is a perhaps troubling and disturbing but important fact about human life because it shapes it should shape every way you think about your life and how you plan out your life. Right, if you know you're going to die, then the decision about how you should spend your time, the projects you should pursue, the people you should be friends with, all of that is much more important. If you don't have an infinite amount of time, if you have a limited amount of time, you have to think carefully about how you're going to spend that time. You have to think carefully about, are the activities I'm engaging on a day-to-day basis worthwhile and meaningful ones? So, in a real way, I think death shapes how we do and how we should live our lives. And for that reason, we need to think carefully about it and how we should react to death, how we should live in the face of death. And one philosopher who did just this, in addition to the ones we've already looked at, is another ancient Greek philosopher named Epicurus. And what we're going to see from Epicurus is he's going to give an argument for maybe what could seem counterintuitive is that there is nothing bad about our death. Now, of course, we've seen Plato argue for this, but what's interesting is Epicurus is going to argue for this claim in a much more maybe straightforward way, in a way that doesn't require any of the view of philosophy or the forms or any of the metaphysical claims that Plato was making. Epicurus thinks if we truly think about what death is in itself, we have no reason to fear it, no reason to think it's bad. But before we get there, I want to make a few other preliminary points about death itself. And where I'd like to start is with a comment that Fred Feldman, a philosopher, makes at the very beginning of his book on death, or one of the chapters in his book on death. He reflects upon the way in which we present or portray death in our common culture. So he says, in myth, literature, and art, death is represented as an ugly, menacing figure, the Grim Reaper. The Reaper has been feared and hated for as long as people have recognized his existence. Indeed, we think of the Reaper and what he represents as an especially mysterious, creepy evil, not just something that's merely unpleasant. We find death so horrible that we avert our eyes in its presence. We rush to find a suitable blanket or coat to cover the body so that passers-by will not see. In the case of a particularly unusual death, we may be at once fascinated and curious to learn more, but then at the same time, we're repelled and perhaps ashamed of ourselves for being interested in something so awful. Nothing, it would seem, is more natural than to think that death is one of the worst misfortunes that can befall a person. So he notes that death is often represented as this grim reaper, as something, evil and ugly and just mysterious and menacing. And to some extent, you can understand why. People, unlike Plato, don't tend to look forward to their death. And also notice that the Grim Reaper is supposed to be sort of a shadowy figure. You don't know when he's going to strike. And it's the same with death. Not only do we have a conscious awareness of death, but unfortunately we don't know when, how, and where we will die. There's a sense in which, if you think about it too much, death can feel as sort of a creeping force, a force that's ever nagging at you, that's ever should be in the back of your mind, that you don't know when it's going to come. And I think for a lot of these reasons, the reason it's important to think about the fact that death is represented as a grim reaper is because it betrays the fact that we often think death is such a bad thing. We often think that death is such a thing to be feared, that can even legitimately cause anxiety for us. Some people have even thought that if you want to explain human social life, the first place you should look is at our anxiety about death. Okay, so it's easy to understand why there are some initial reasons to take this view of death. But I want to take a more specific view, and I want to separate for us as philosophers two different questions which we can ask. So the first question about death we can ask when we're evaluating this idea that death is like the Grim Reaper is death bad for us? Like a shadowy figure like the Grim Reaper sneaking up on you, that seems bad. But is that an accurate representation of death? Is death actually bad for the person who dies? And if you think about the common way this is answered, not necessarily Plato or Socrates' answer, but if you just ask the average person would say, yeah, all things being equal, unless you're in an extreme circumstance, you're under extraordinary pain, then yeah, your death is bad for you, and not just bad, but among the worst things you can suffer. That's a common answer. And the badness question is related to a separate question, what I'll call the fear question. Given what we think about the badness of death, is it rational to fear one's death? Now notice, just at the outset, it could be possible that your death could be bad for you. It might even be the worst thing that could happen to you, but you might not have a good reason to fear it. Because you might say, well, look, yes, I understand that death is very bad, but it's also inevitable. And would it be practically useful, would it be productive for me to live my life in fear of something that I know is inevitable, even if that inevitable thing is bad? We might think fear has a function. Fear has a function of making us avoid dangers that we can't avoid. But if death is not something we can avoid, then maybe it's not right to fear it. Maybe this fear comes from a confused view of death. But in any case, if we again think about the common answer to the fear question, if you ask the person, do you fear death? If a lot of people are honest with themselves, they'll say, yes, since death is such a horrible thing, perhaps I fear it more than anything else. Or if there's something you fear more than your own death, it very likely could be the death of your loved ones. So we have these two separate questions, and we have the common answers, that death is bad, it's one of the worst things, and it's worth fearing. And what we're going to see from Epicurus, however, is he's going to say both of these answers are wrong. Death is not bad for us, and because it's not bad, we have no reason to fear it. So how does he make this point? Well, so the argument we're going to look at is from a work of his entitled Letter to Menicius. And in the very first paragraph, right, so here's Epicurus, and in the very first paragraph of that work, he makes this point about how there's a connection between philosophy and living a good life. Now, this shouldn't be a huge surprise, as we've seen Socrates and Plato also have this connection, but it's worth looking at exactly how he establishes this. So I've broken up the passage here and into two claims. So first, here's part of what he says in that opening paragraph. He who says either that the time for philosophy has not yet come, or that it is past, is like someone who says that the time for happiness has not yet come, or that it is past. And of course we would never say this. We would never say, well, it's not really the right time for happiness. It's not the right time to live a good life. And so Epicurus thinks, well, if you want to live a good life, philosophy and reasoning carefully about important topics like death is an absolute necessity to living such a life. Okay, so But we might wonder, well, why is that? And specifically in the context of death, if our lives are made worse by the fact that we fear death, if we think death is a bad thing, then how can thinking philosophically about death help us? Well, notice the second part of this passage. Therefore, both young and old must philosophize. The latter so that although he may stay young in good things, owing to gratitude for what has occurred, the former so that although young, he too may be like an old man, owing to his lack of fear of what is to come. So he says that engaging in philosophy will lessen the fear of the young and increase the gratitude of the old. Now, why is this? Well, you might imagine a person who's relatively young, and just for me personally, I can tell you at exactly the moment which death anxiety hit me pretty hard. It was right at age 30. There was something about age 30 at which I suddenly realized, I mean, I knew it, but I appreciated it in a new way, the fact that I was going to die. It also could have been related to the fact that I was reading a book on philosophy of death at the time, so maybe there's something there as well. But, at age 30, I'm still a relatively young person. We think if everything goes well, I've got a lot of life to live in front of me. But you're living your life, you're just investing in your projects, and then one day, it just sort of hits you, my life is going to come to an end. There will be a point at which I no longer exist. And you can imagine this bringing up a sort of fear for someone who's saying, okay, well, now I really have to think about how I ought to spend my time. I really have to think about, right, you feel the time sort of slipping through your fingers. So he says philosophy will cure those who are young of this fear. Now, it's interesting, you might think that he would say the old would have this fear as well because they know death is more imminent. And maybe that's true, but he says mostly what philosophy does for the old is give them a sense of gratitude. Because, look, you might say, for instance, that you might imagine someone who is elderly, who sees their death as being imminent, who becomes resentful of the fact that they're going to die, resentful of the fact that they no longer can enjoy the things they used to enjoy. And Epicurus says, no, if we engage in philosophy, then those who are old or closer to death will, instead of being resentful at the fact that they will no longer live, will be grateful for the life they did live. So there's a couple points to make here. First, at root of the fear of death and the resentment of death is the idea that death is bad. You wouldn't fear death if you didn't think it was bad. You wouldn't resent dying if you didn't think it was bad. So to the extent that Epicurus thinks that philosophy can cure us of the idea that death is bad, he also thinks it can cure us of our fear and resentment. Now, the idea that those who are close to death should look back on life with gratitude, this also makes an important claim about what makes life good in the first place. So it just tells us there's more to the story. So first we have to understand why death is not bad to get this result. Then we also have to ask the question, what makes life good? And Epicurus will later give us an answer to that, which we'll look at in a later video. Okay, but so first, the first order of business is to argue, why is death not bad for us? And Epicurus does that in the following very famous passage from the letter to Menicius. And I'm going to call the argument that he gives here the Epicurean argument. And I'm going to take it step by step, premise by premise, so that we can see what the outline is. So first, Epicurus says, get used to believing that death is nothing to us, for all good and bad consists in sense experience. So here's the first premise. Here's my gloss on it. Some event can only be bad or good for some person if that event affects that person's sense experience. Now, there's a couple points to make here, right? First, this is very, very different from the outlook we get from Plato. Plato held that the senses are what confuse us, they lead us astray, that what really matters is the soul, what matters is leaving the body and senses behind, and what is good for the body doesn't matter. All that matters is what is good for the soul. Epicurus completely rejects this. As we're going to see momentarily, he thinks that pleasure is what is good, pain is what is bad. A life filled with as much pleasure as possible is the best sort of life. And the foundation of that claim just is that all goodness or badness is resolved into sense experience. And you might say, well, why is this? Why should we think that's true? Well, here's one way to think about it. Consider an object like a rock, or even a tree, which is a living entity that's more complex than a rock. So think about a tree. So let's say you chop down that tree. Now, you chopping down that tree might be good or it might be bad, right? It might be good if you need it to burn a fire to keep you warm and allow you to survive. It might be bad if you're if you're engaged in deforestation and too many trees are dying, which are necessary for the health of the environment, right? That action might be good or bad. But notice, whether that action is good or bad depends on its effect on other people. Are you using the wood to keep yourself warm? That seems like it's good for you. Are you cutting down too many trees such it's bad for the environment? That's bad for the humans and other animals who depend on the environment. But at no point did I ever get to the point where I'm saying, well, it would really be bad for the tree if you chop the tree down. Because we don't think it would be bad for the tree. And the reason we don't think that is because the tree has no first-person conscious awareness, has no sense experience. And if it has no sense experience, nothing can be bad for it, and nothing can be good for it. A tree lives, I guess, an entirely neutral life, if you even want to say it lives a life in this sense at all. Whatever happens to the tree might be good or bad for others, but it cannot be good or bad for the tree. And so for this reason, Epicurus is just saying that what makes your life go bad or well will depend on how what happens in your life affects your sense experience. Okay, so it's a reasonable premise. Now let's continue with the argument. So he says, for all good and bad consist in sense experience, and death is the privation of sense experience. So what's the second premise? Death does not affect the sense experience of the person who dies. Now, this is also a different definition of death than we saw for Plato, for instance. Plato defined death as the separation of the soul and body, and he's not overly specific about what is supposed to happen after your soul separates from your body, in the sense of, like, do you still have a conscious awareness? How do you gain knowledge of the forms? How do you reason? Right? But it's very clear that Plato thinks there's something going on after your body dies. But Epicurus didn't think this. Death is the cessation of sense experience. That means once you're died, that's it for you. The lights go out, there's nothing else going on. And this, in large part, is what sort of explains our fear of death, because that doesn't sound overly pleasant. We are anxious to hold on to this conscious awareness and sense experience that we have. But in any case, because once you die, there's nothing else going on, the lights are out, there's no more sense experience, that also means death does not affect the sense experience of the person who dies. If there is a dead individual, it's not that they're experiencing something new they weren't experiencing when they were alive. They're simply not experiencing anything. Okay, so let's put these two premises together. Some event can only be bad or good for some person if the event affects that person's sense experience. Death does not affect the sense experience of the person who dies. What can we conclude? Here's how Epicurus puts it. Hence, a correct knowledge of the fact that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life a matter for contentment. So, I'm going to get back to what Epicurus says there specifically in a moment. But first, what we conclude from these two statements is that death is not bad for the one who dies. If an event can only be good or bad if it affects our sense experience, and death doesn't affect our sense experience, then death is not bad for us. And this is it's a very straightforward argument. When we really take it seriously, you start to say, well, why didn't I look at death this way before? If death just is nothingness, if death just is total lack of awareness, well, why is that such a bad thing? I mean, if you thought after your death you were going to go somewhere to be tortured and experience horrible pain, that would be one thing. But if death just is the complete cessation of sense experience, then how can death be bad for the one who dies? If all badness requires some sort of pain, some sort of discomfort, and death is none of those things, then it's not clear why we're saying death is bad in the first place. And look at the way Epicurus puts this. First, a correct knowledge of the fact that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life a matter for contentment. He even says that this makes the fact that we're going to die something to be content about or happy about. I'm not sure he's actually shown this, right? So the fact that I'm going to not experience anything, it doesn't necessarily make me happy, but it also, I think he's right to say maybe it shouldn't make us sad in the same way. Is death like the Grim Reaper sneaking up on you and causing you great pain and discomfort? Well, no. It's just the cessation of sense experience that you had before. And as we said, when Socrates is bringing this idea up in the Apology, if there's nothing all that bad about a dreamless sleep, and death is like that, then it's not clear how death can be bad for the one who dies. Sure, death can be bad for other people, right? Other people after we die, our family and friends and those who love us, will experience pain from our life ending. But it's not bad for us. And so if you're going to fear death on their behalf, but not on your behalf. So this is the basic foundation of the argument. Now he continues on as well, because he hasn't said much about, he said something about the badness of death, but not the fear of death. So he continues on, he says, "For there's nothing fearful in life for the one who has grasped that there's nothing fearful in the absence of life. Thus he is a fool who says that he fears death not because it will be painful when present, but because it is painful when it is still to come. For that which while present causes no distress causes unnecessary pain when merely anticipated." Epicurus says, okay, we all sort of know this. Like, we don't think about it in this premise-conclusion form, but we all understand, he thinks, that death, when we die, completely makes our sense experience go away. And we also understand that merely not sensing anything isn't so bad. So he says we're acting like fools when we still continue to fear death. He is a fool who says that he fears death not because it will be painful. It's not like we think death is going to be painful. It's not like we think we're going to be buried and we're going to be experiencing pain. But we fear death because it's painful when it's still to come. It's painful now. He says we're in this paradoxical situation where the fear of death we have is just because of all these misconceptions about it. We act like death is going to be some horrible thing, and that's why we fear it now. But if we really think critically about it, we should see that death is just the cessation of experience. And if that's all death is, then why are you giving yourself unnecessary discomfort by fearing something that you know isn't going to be painful, isn't going to be uncomfortable? It's just going to be the lack of sense experience, which, like, as I said it before, which, like a dreamless sleep, really isn't all that bad. So we can gloss this premise as, if death is not bad for the one who dies, then there's no reason to fear death. Death is nothing to us. To fear death is just to fear some imagined pain or discomfort that you seem to imagine you'll be experiencing when you're dead. And so this gives us the final conclusion, and he expresses it in a couple of different ways. At the very beginning, he said, get used to believing that death is nothing to us. Again, he says, so death, the most frightening of bad things, is nothing to us. And so the final conclusion is, there simply is no reason to fear death. So from Epicurus, we have an answer to both of the questions I gave at the outset. Conclusion 1, death is not bad for us. It's not bad for the one who dies. Conclusion 2, there's also no reason to fear death. Now, given how counterintuitive, but also straightforward the argument is, it's worth really thinking about a little further. And there are two major questions that I think we should think about when evaluating this argument. So first, let's think about P1. Some event can only be bad or good for some person if the event affects that person's sense experience. Isn't that true? And the question I want you to ask yourself is, can you think of anything that's bad for you, or would be bad for you, even if it in no way affected your experience? Can you think of something that would be bad for you, even if you never found out about it? Even if it never caused you any direct pain? Because if there is something like that, then you might say, well, look, I understand that when I'm dead, I'm not going to be feeling pain. But at the same time, maybe death is one of those things where it can be bad for us even if it doesn't affect our experience. So that's one thing to think about. And then also think about premise 3. If death is not bad for the one who dies, then there is no reason to fear death. Now, in terms of this premise, I want you to ask yourself the following question. Why, if you have fear of death, why do you fear your death? What is it that you fear? I'm willing to bet that, like Epicurus, you don't fear your death because you think it's necessarily going to be a painful experience. So, if you don't fear death because you think it's going to be painful to be dead, then what is it that you fear out of death? If death anxiety hits you at some point, if you realize in a real concrete way the finitude of your life, then why is that disturbing to you? I think if you start to think along those lines, we can see that there might be some possibilities that this very straightforward argument, at least at the moment, leaves out. Okay, but I will stop there. I'll be interested to see what you have to say about this argument, and I will see you in the next video.